Okay, so before I start this, I just want to point out that back in November 2013, I actually did a short interview with Tyler Joseph. That's actually the first interview I've ever done, really. Unfortunately, it was just before I started this channel, which means it didn't really give this channel much exposure. But on the bright side, it did get upwards of like 10,000 views, thanks to actually being cited on the Wikipedia page for Vessel, referring to where the title of the album came from. So there's that, and if you guys are curious, I'll just link that in the description. And yeah, let's get this going. Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Spin It Reviews, and today I'm going to be talking about the new album from 21 Pilots called Blurryface. You know, I think one benefit I have to being one of the younger, serious music reviewers on this site is that rather than my nostalgic years being in the 90s or the early to mid 2000s, some of my favorite albums that I've connected with have just come out within the last few years or so. And a perfect example of that to me is Vessel by 21 Pilots, which came out just over 2 years ago, but since then has quickly became one of my favorite albums in general. Now, I know that there are all kinds of abstract genres that are a lot more weird and technically proficient and whatnot, but for the scene 21 Pilots comes from, they're definitely one of the more unapologetically unique acts you'll come across. Is it indie pop, alternative hip hop, synth pop, EDM, singer-songwriter, ukulele folk? Who knows really? But at the end of the day, judging by the huge and dedicated fan base the band's amassed, it's pretty clear that their eclectic sound is connecting with people, and for good reason. For those unfamiliar, 21 Pilots is a duo from Ohio, currently comprising of drummer Josh Dunn and Tyler Joseph, who as the singer, rapper, keyboardist, songwriter, and lyricist is definitely the creative force behind the group. They put out 2 albums in 2009 and 2011, which are both great. But it was on that big debut of Fuel by Ramen with Vessel, where the band's sound really came together in a cohesive way, balancing these upbeat, keyboard-led pop tunes with ridiculously catchy hooks. Tyler's rapping that actually doesn't come off gimmicky like you might think it would, thanks to him actually having a good amount of technical ability in that department. And some pretty deep, dark lyrics, dealing with stuff like depression, various personal demons, and that search to try to connect with people to communicate with about these issues. And I gotta say, even as someone who doesn't suffer from stuff like clinical depression or suicidal thoughts, there are still a lot of spots on this album that I found myself really connecting with and getting moved by. In a way, I think what makes this kind of crazy dichotomy work for them is that the music is connecting with people going through these issues, but the message is one that a good deal of the time tries to be generally uplifting. So conveying these ideas through these infectious pop synth lines and sing-along choruses actually feels quite natural. So yeah, I really liked Vessel. My favorite album of 2013, and again, honestly, in my top 10 period. That being said, I do get why someone couldn't quite get into 21 Pilots. Maybe they prefer their depressive lyrics with more fitting instrumentation, or they might find Tyler's rather quirky and kind of nasal vocal delivery a little annoying. I kind of get that, but it's never really been an issue for me. Okay, so enough fanboying. Let's talk about their follow-up to Vessel called Blurryface. Now, going in, I knew this probably wasn't gonna top one of my all-time favorite albums for obvious reasons, and it didn't. But there's still a lot to love in this album, and even some advancements in their overall style that definitely need to be commended. First off, I love how conceptual this album is. Now, don't get me wrong, Vessel did have a very cohesive theme to it, and even a bit of narrative flow in the sequencing of the songs, but for as awesomely as it was done, those themes were fairly broad in how they were covered. Here, though, we see Tyler not just talking about the chaos going on in his head, but actually zeroing in on the source of them in a very inventive way. Basically, the titular character, Blurryface, is sort of a mental manifestation of every insecurity, doubt in people, the world, and every other kind of negative thought like that, combined into this one mentally created person, an alter ego, if you will. And throughout this thing, we see Tyler both directly and indirectly dealing with Blurryface's effect on his own mind. The introduction to this character comes in on the track Stressed Out, which sort of bounces around topics. One part shows him feeling like he's just not a good songwriter because Blurryface keeps giving him these ridiculously high standards to live up to, probably not helped by the massive success of Vessel that he has to follow up, while later on in the song, Tyler sort of details his fear of growing up and living in the complicated real world of adulthood. What I really like about this is that while other songs with this kind of general idea might come off whiny or immature, the way he tackles it here actually comes off very genuine, complete with some nice creative imagery in the second verse. And I gotta say that as an aspiring songwriter and someone who's sort of going through that kind of transition in life, I really connected with this song personally. One recurring thing you might notice on this album is that voice lowering effect that pops up here and there. Now, I'll admit, when I first heard it on the lead single from this thing, Fairly Local, I couldn't help but roll my eyes a little, frankly. But once I realized that it represents Blurryface's interference into Tyler's mind, and accepting that in context, both of these songs actually grew on me a really good amount. And speaking of Fairly Local, I love the dark, bassy instrumental on this song. It definitely did a good job of giving the fans a sort of different vibe as what they got in the last album, but not so much that it'd alienate people by completely 180ing. Plus, it shows off a certain newfound sense of confidence in the band that I'm really glad appears here, since it would have been easy for them to just regurgitate the sadness of Vessel for the whole album, just to pander to the fans that liked it the first time. But instead, on quite a few moments here, they actually take a moment to either reflect on the more positive changes in Tyler's mental state, or just celebrate how far they've come as a band since that last album. Like on the song Lane Boy, which essentially shows them reveling in their own unmarketability. Like I said before, I'm a sucker for good meta commentary in a song, and here it's filled with this fun and frankly justified cockiness that I can't get enough of. A line that really stood out to me in particular was, "All these songs I'm hearing are so heartless. Don't trust a perfect person and don't trust a song that's flawless." Plus that genre change up in the second half to this propulsive, almost like 90s breakbeat-ish beat was just a great touch, really that cherry on top to this declaration of unpredictability. That kind of beat also pops up on the opener here, Heavy Dirty Soul, which in addition to being very multifaceted, much like Vessel opener Ode to Sleep, also sets the lyrical tone, talking about Tyler's dedicated goal to find purpose in life and convey it artistically. Meanwhile, that kind of positivity I was talking about earlier also pops up in my personal favorite song, and one of my favorite songs of the year so far, Tear in My Heart. It's by far the most perfect pop song on this album, combining a somewhat live piano rock feel in the verses with a chorus that just escalates further and further with these great synth arpeggios on top of it. It basically talks about finding that person in your life that can just bring out the best in you, a very sweet and likable message for sure. Going back to the more conceptually related elements of this album with the Blurryface character, the songs The Judge and Doubt later on in the album really bring out that religious element to the band that was a lot more prevalent on their first couple albums. Here talking about how Blurryface can make Tyler question his otherwise very dedicated belief system by making him a lot more pessimistic and nihilist. The Judge in particular has this running metaphor involving a house in the second verse that's just fantastically written. Then there's Hometown and Not Today, which more so than any other song here, really show off that dichotomy that goes on in his head throughout the course of this thing, as the album climaxes with him essentially going to war with his own subconscious, which is detailed in a really cool way. And meanwhile, musically, Hometown in particular shows off some of those more EDM-influenced elements from past tracks like Car Radio and Trees, and it works in a really great way. And the beautifully emotional closer Goner ends the album on a sorta up in the air note. Now, I don't really want to spoil this album for anyone, as silly as that might be to say, just because I feel like the end of the storyline here should be up to the listener's interpretation, but just saying how I see it as him giving into the reality that while these negative thoughts will always pop up here and there, at the end of the day, it's really up for him to determine how much he wants to buy what Blurryface is selling, and how much he's willing to control that more irrational side of his mind. It's a very sobering ending for an incredibly detailed and expertly crafted album. That all being said, you might be listening to me raving about this album for the past 6, 7, whatever minutes, and thinking, wow, Mark, this album sounds incredible, perfect even. Why do you not consider this a full step up from Vessel? Well, unfortunately, it really just comes down to the presence of some weaker tracks that don't advance the story or frankly do anything for me whatsoever. Stuff like the overbearing pop reggae influence on Ride and that awkward pseudo-Caribbean accent on Polarize make me just cringe, and the instrumentation on Message Man is just kinda ugly and clunky, not helped by being the one moment where that sorta subtle defensiveness in terms of them not being what the mainstream wants can kinda cross over into being a bit less likable in my opinion. Really, like with their first two albums, what could have been an amazing 10 or 11 track album that just crossed over the 40 or 45 minute mark is a 14 track one that, while still great, isn't quite as great as it could have been if they were willing to trim the fat a little more. Like with Vessel, I could point to any track on that album and have no problem calling one of my favorites, and I honestly couldn't do that with Blurryface. But if you couldn't tell by the other 80% of this video, I'm still really loving Blurryface. Those duds aside, it advances 21 Pilot's sound, message, and overall presence in all the right ways. And I'm going to give it an 8.5 overall. If you're a fan, I can guarantee it won't disappoint. And if you're looking for something truly unique in the indie pop world, then definitely check this thing out. So if you guys have heard this album, what do you think about it? Do you agree with what I had to say? Disagree? Have any feedback about the channel in general? Let me know in the comments down below. Share this around with anyone who might be interested. Like the Facebook page in the description for updates, and hopefully I'll see you in the next episode of Spinner Reviews. Oh, and fun fact, I actually ended up listening to Vessel because fellow modern electropop innovator Robert DeLong was opening for them at the show I was going to be seeing him at. So if I can give another recommendation here, then his album Just Movement is a great one, and as well as his latest single Long Way Down, which I'll link in the description. That's about it.